I love the system. The timekeeping is so efficient that I don't have to do much as a panel moderator. Our next speaker is Steve Polasky, who's at the University of Minnesota. He's, like me, another social scientist. Steve's going to be talking about making nature count, rewriting economic and political rules to account for the value of ecosystem services. Steve, thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. Taking seriously that this session is about solutions, the great temptation, of course, is to talk about, I've done work on value of ecosystem services and work that's very similar to what Elena presented. I knew Elena was going to be present beforehand, so I'm going to resist that and really try to talk about solutions. And so in thinking about this, I actually had... Okay, there we go. So I was thinking about this, and I had sort of 4 questions and an objective, and that sort of rang a bell with something else. So since this is also a US, UK, one of my favorite UK movies, but so what am I talking about here? So first of all, we are trying to think about how we are going to adjust how we humans fit into this planet, and climate change being a primary example of how we're changing the system in ways that may be detrimental to our current and future well-being. So how are we going to manage ourselves? I've talked about managing ecosystems, but this is, how do we interact with ecosystems for an objective? And it could be maintaining the flow of benefits, sort of ecosystem services, but it might be biodiversity, other things. Obviously, it's an important thing to have clear ahead of time, and I'm not going to talk about how do we set the objective, but there are then the science questions, right? So that's the first set, and it's really tempting in an audience like this to spend all of my time talking about the science questions. What are our things that we can do, and how do those link to the objective, what we're trying to achieve, maintaining the flow of benefits? How would we do that? How would we manage a system in order to maintain those benefits? But the second question then is, okay, so what are the benefits and the costs? What are the trade-offs? And so an economist might do a benefit cost assessment, trying to figure out what those are. But that leads to a very related question. So sometimes you can talk about political economy, but not just what are the benefits and costs, but who bears those benefits and costs? Who wins and loses under a management option? Because we can have things that make sense for the long term and for all of society, but if the people who have to make that decision or bear those costs, if they're not getting enough of those benefits, then they'll block it. And we see that over and over again. So just this question of if we do the science and we have it, that's enough. It's like, no, that's not going to be enough. We have to answer these economic, political questions in order really to get to this last one, the implementation question. How do we design institutions or policies basically so that the winners from this actually have enough power to carry out the management action? So there's really, the science is clearly a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. There are these other dimensions when you actually get to trying to get solutions and implement them on the ground. Okay, let me provide a couple of very quick examples. So one is we've been doing work in China. We work with people at the Chinese Academy of Sciences who are linked very closely to the government. So the science questions that they were interested in are what are the set of important ecosystem services, where are they produced across the country, and then that directly led into the government zoning parts of the country for saying that the highest value of use in these areas is the protection of natural capital, so these ecological function conservation areas. That's at a high level on the ground or getting down closer. So thinking about particular services here, water supply for Beijing, the Miyun Reservoir. Upstream from this, there's a lot of farming activity. How do we get farmers to adopt different crops, so out of paddy rice, in order to improve water quality and increase the flow of water supply down to Beijing? So there are a number of approaches that one can use, so public policy approaches, zoning, land use zoning, or payments for ecosystem services. This is the Conservation Reserve Program in the U.S. Unfortunately, earlier this week, carbon pricing did not take a step forward in the U.S. You should talk to Josh Lawler, who's a resident of Washington State, figure out why. But there are also a lot of private sector initiatives. So oftentimes we just think about public, but there are corporate sustainability. There are commodity roundtables on sustainability practices. And then there are also civil society initiatives, changing norms, the no smoking norm. That's a huge shift within my lifetime. And then finally, and not least, is thinking about technology. So, being less optimistic on the carbon pricing front, which economists would love to have, but we've actually made great progress just because of the technology. It's so much cheaper now to have wind and solar than it used to be. So with that, I will stop. Thanks.